This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review. And what I'm looking at today is 2008's The Punisher Warzone, directed by Lexi Alexander. Punisher first appeared in comics in 1974 and is the creation of Jerry Conway, Ross Andru, and John Romita Jr. And this has always been a character that has been somewhat difficult to portray in movies, which is interesting because he's frankly the character played by Charles Bronson in Death Wish. That is the Punisher, but for some reason he tends to be a difficult character for people to adapt into live action. There have been numerous movies as well as television series based on the character, but nothing seems to click. The reason for that happening is because, as I said, he is frankly the character from Death Wish. I think his name is Paul Kersey, played by Charles Bronson. And he has no superpowers per se. So what he had is a superhuman drive and a sense of being wronged. And also the ability, through violence, to right said wrongs. In the comics, he's been depicted in lots of ways. Sometimes he's been depicted as a superhero in the vein of Spider-Man and other characters, while other times he's been literally an angel. He's been through a lot of iterations, in other words. That brings us to Lexi Alexander's Punisher Warzone. And it is bonkers. It's almost as if Jason from Friday the 13th were going around shooting people, which is ludicrous, but this movie is also ludicrous. I get the feeling that Lexi Alexander has never read a comic in her life. And I don't mean that as a criticism of her. Well, kinda. Though the thing is, she does very well with what she has. But as I said, she doesn't understand comic books. And so she tries to interpret the Punisher fairly literally, which means for the most part, you have a killing machine who goes out into a technicolor world and shoots people for various reasons. This movie is a comedy, oddly enough, because the violence is so gratuitous and over the top that it's genuinely funny at points. It is ridiculous the way he kills people. He literally punches through someone's head, which is bonkers. And this movie is indeed bonkers. It is nuts. It is also enjoyable. And I recall when this movie came out that a lot of critics were very hard on it. And I can see that, though compared to more modern interpretations of superheroes, it's actually pretty good. It's well shot and gorgeous to look at. Though as I said, it takes itself too literally. It's almost as if filmmakers don't seem to understand that Punisher, particularly in his later runs, was an attempt by comic book writers to create a more realistic character. Realistic in terms of his violence, and realistic in the way he went about doing things. As I said, Lexi Alexander, I suspect, has never read a Punisher comic other than for this movie. She doesn't understand that this is supposed to be a realistic character, so she changes him into an ultra-violent cartoon. It is, as I said, bonkers. And they also created a character for the movie called Looney Bin Jim, played by the guy who played the mutant in one of the early X-Files episodes. And he's pretty good, but everything in this movie is dialed to 11. It is such an unsubtle movie. It is, I can't quit saying how bonkers this movie is. It's enjoyable, it's quite watchable, but it's ridiculous. It needed to be reined in. It needed to tell a story about actual people as opposed to a story about cartoon characters, which the Punisher is. And oddly enough, the Punisher is more realistic in his comics than he is in this movie. For me, it ruins what an interpretation of a comic book on screen in live action is supposed to be. Namely, making it more real. And I get it that people are climbing walls and doing this, that, and the other. But still, the goal is realism. And this is something that Marvel Comics have always tried to do, much more so than DC. Namely, create characters that exist in a real world. That's why Spider-Man lived in Manhattan, as opposed to, let's say, many DC characters who lived in places like Metropolis or some such made-up city. By the way, Metropolis literally means city, which is kind of dumb if you think about it. Marvel always tended to ground their characters. So to see the live-action version playing into the more silly aspects of the character is disheartening, to say the least. And once again, I'm not saying this movie is bad. And as I said, it is one of the better interpretations of the Punisher. It's not as good as John Bernthal's interpretation, though it's certainly better than any others that have come down the pike. It just needed to take the world it exists in seriously and to lighten up on the gore. This is probably one of the most violent superhero movies I have ever seen. It is batshit in terms of its violence. And I know I'm kind of late in getting around to the story because the story doesn't really matter. Not really. In any case, it is an origin story for Jigsaw, who is one of the Punisher's enemies in the comics. And like most things in this movie, he's interpreted fairly accurately, at least in the visual sense. And as I mentioned earlier, they invented a character called Looney Bin Jim for this movie. I don't know why they did that. And there's a scene in the last section of the movie where Looney Bin Jim has a fight with the Punisher and uses parkour to beat him up pretty well. I mean, at some point the Punisher does turn the tables on Looney Bin Jim, but for a bit of time he has his way with him. For a bit of time he does really well against the Punisher. It is ludicrous, it is stupid, but as I said, this whole movie is in its way stupid. It is just ridiculously over the top. And when you can do things like shooting someone performing parkour out of the sky with a grenade launcher, I think it was, you're really talking batshit crazy. And this movie is. The Punisher Warzone revels in its own lunacy. It is enjoyable for that reason alone. It doesn't hold back. It just goes for it. It is ridiculous. It is a cartoon. It is ultra-violent when it doesn't need to be ultra-violent. And keep in mind, the Punisher is, by nature, a violent character. Though the mistake the movie makes is that the violence is of such a nature that it becomes virtually numbing. You don't really care about any of the people being killed, and it becomes gratuitous, like a Friday the 13th movie. It's violence existing for the point of violence, which, honestly, the Punisher deserves better. Now what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow.